The carriage turned onto the lane at 3:15 on a Tuesday in October, and Isobel Crane looked out the window and said nothing. She had been told the estate was in need of attention. Those had been her father's exact words, spoken over the dining table in Halifax 3 weeks before the wedding, in the same tone he used when discussing weather and shipping delays. In need of attention. As though she were being sent to trim a hedge. What she saw was a stone house that had not been trimmed in years. The east wall was streaked with damp. One of the upper shutters hung at an angle, still attached by a single hinge, swinging slightly in the wind off the bay. The front garden had gone entirely to seed. Not wild in any romantic sense, but collapsed, the way things collapse when no one has been watching. She could see where the beds had once been, the faint geometry of them beneath the weeds. Someone had planted this garden with care, once. That person was gone now. The man beside her, her husband of 11 days, looked at the house and then looked away, toward the water. His name was Callum Harte. He was 34 years old, the eldest son of a Nova Scotia shipbuilding family that had made its money in the previous generation and had been quietly losing it in this one. He had dark eyes and a careful, guarded way of moving, as though he expected things to fall. He had not kissed her at their wedding. He had pressed his lips to her cheek, briefly, in the manner of someone fulfilling a contractual obligation, and then he had stepped back. They had spoken perhaps 40 sentences to each other in the 11 days since. The driver opened the door. Callum stepped out first, did not offer his hand. Isobel climbed down herself, her boots finding the gravel, and she stood in the gray October light and looked at the house that was now, apparently, hers. A woman appeared in the doorway. She was perhaps 60, with the posture of someone who had been standing in doorways and managing things for a very long time. She introduced herself as Mrs. Dougal, the housekeeper, and she shook Isobel's hand with a directness that felt, in that moment, like the only honest thing that had happened all day. "There is tea," Mrs. Dougal said, "and I've aired the east rooms." Callum said he had business in town and would not stay for dinner. He left before the luggage was unloaded. Isobel stood in the front hall with Mrs. Dougal and 2 trunks and listened to the sound of carriage wheels on gravel until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she turned and looked at what she had been given. The hall was large and cold. The ceilings were high, which would have been elegant if anything else about the room had cooperated. The wallpaper had buckled along the north wall. The mirror above the side table was filmed with dust. A clock on the landing had stopped at 9:20. She couldn't tell if it was morning or evening, and she supposed it didn't matter. "How long has the house been like this?" she asked. Mrs. Dougal was quiet for just a moment. "Since Mrs. Harte passed," she said. 3 years now. Mr. Harte closed most of the rooms. Kept himself to the study and his bedroom. How many staff? Myself and Samuel, who does the grounds, though there hasn't been much to do, as you'll have seen, and the cook, Mrs. Finlay. 3 people for a house of this size. Isobel looked up at the ceiling. There was a brown stain in one corner, the ghost of a leak long since dried. "All right," she said. "Let's have that tea." She did not sleep well. The bedroom was large and unfamiliar, and the wind off the Atlantic came through the window frame in a thin, cold stream no matter how she adjusted the latch. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, settle and thought about what she knew. She knew the Harte family had owned this estate for 30 years. She knew Callum's father had died 18 months ago. She knew the Halifax solicitor who had arranged the marriage. On both sides, she suspected, had referred to the estate as a sound asset requiring management. She knew her own father had considered this arrangement a relief, in the way that the marriages of daughters were always, at some level, a relief to the fathers who arranged them. What she had not known, until she walked through the rooms the next morning with Mrs. Dougal, was quite how thoroughly things had been left to ruin. The roof over the back kitchen was sound. The structural walls were fine. But the east wing had been shut and unlived in for so long that the cold had worked its way into the plaster, and 2 of the rooms on the upper floor had damp that needed addressing before the real winter set in. The kitchen garden was a season's worth of labor from being productive again. The fencing along the south pasture had come down in a storm the previous spring, and no one had repaired it, and the 2 horses that remained were being kept in a paddock half the proper size. Isobel wrote it all down. She had brought 3 notebooks with her from Halifax, and she filled the first 6 pages of the first one before noon. "You're very thorough," Mrs. Dougal said, watching her. "I grew up managing my father's accounts," Isobel said. "He had 3 warehouses and poor eyesight, and a conviction that numbers would sort themselves out if you left them long enough." She looked up. They never did. That afternoon, she asked for the estate's financial records. Mrs. Dougal brought her to the study. Callum's study, though he had not been in it since they arrived, and gestured at a cabinet along the wall. Inside were ledgers. Isobel pulled them out and stacked them on the desk and began to read. It took her 2 days. She was not a trained accountant, but she had spent enough years watching figures that she knew what healthy ones looked like. These did not look healthy. The estate's income from the tenant farms to the south was being collected by an agent named Pratt through a firm called Aldermere Property and Land. The fee Aldermere charged for this service was listed, each quarter, in small careful handwriting. 8% of collection. Only it wasn't 8%. Isobel checked 3 times. Then she found the original agreement, tucked at the back of the cabinet, a year before Callum's father had died. The agreement specified 4%, not 8.4. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she wrote a letter to Aldermere Property and Land, requesting a full accounting of all fees charged since the agreement's commencement. She wrote a second letter to the solicitor in Halifax. She wrote a third to the tenant farmers themselves, introducing herself as the current mistress of the estate, and asking, as politely as she could manage, whether anyone had been collecting rent in person, and if so, who. She sealed all 3 letters and asked Samuel to take them to the post. She did not mention any of this to Callum when he returned 2 days later. He came in the evening, briefly, to change clothes. He said the weather was turning. She agreed that it was. He left again the next morning before she came down to breakfast. She did not ask where he went, not because she didn't want to know, but because she understood by then that the answer would require him to say more to her than he had said in total across the course of their marriage, and she was not sure either of them was ready for that. The first response came from the tenant farmers. A man named Bernard wrote a careful, slightly defensive letter explaining that he had been paying his rent to a Mr. Staines, who came by every quarter on behalf of Aldermere. Isobel wrote back and thanked him, and asked if Mr. Staines provided receipts. Bernard wrote again to say that the receipts had the name of the firm at the top, but no amount recorded, only a stamp. She stared at that letter for a long time. Then she put on her coat and her boots, and she walked to the south pasture, and looked at the broken fencing, and she thought about what it means, when the person entrusted to look after something is the same person quietly taking from it. When she went back inside, she sat down at the desk and she wrote a very different letter to Aldermere. Not a request this time, but a notice. She had identified a discrepancy between the contracted fee and the fees as charged. She intended to address this discrepancy. She would be in contact with their office directly within the fortnight, and she expected their cooperation. Mrs. Dougal found her still at the desk at 9 o'clock that night. "You haven't eaten," the older woman said. "I know." Isobel set down her pen. "Mrs. Dougal, did you know about the fees? About Aldermere?" The housekeeper was quiet. "Then, I knew the accounts looked wrong. I didn't know what to do about it. I don't have that kind of knowledge." "Who did Mr. Harte, the older Mr. Harte, trust with the financial management?" "His solicitor, mostly, and then Aldermere came in the last year of his life, when his health was poor. Mr. Callum was in Montreal by then." A pause. "He didn't come home until after the funeral." Isobel filed that away. "All right," she said. "Go to bed. I'll eat something." She ate cold bread and cheese standing up at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the October dark, and then she went back to the desk and kept working. Callum came home properly for the first time in the 3rd week of November. By properly she meant, he was there at dinner, he sat across from her, and they ate in a silence that had evolved somewhat from their first silence. The first silence had been the silence of strangers. This was the silence of 2 people who had been occupying the same space long enough to have developed opinions about each other that they hadn't yet decided whether to voice. He looked at the dining room, she noticed. He noticed that the wallpaper had been cleaned, that the window had been relatched and no longer rattled, that there were candles on the table, real ones, not the stubs she had found in the drawer. He didn't say anything about any of it. After dinner, he went to the study. 15 minutes later, he appeared in the doorway of the sitting room where she was reading. "You've been in the ledgers," he said. "Yes." He leaned against the doorframe. He had a glass in his hand, something amber. "Why?" "Because they were there." She looked up. "And because the numbers were wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "Wrong how?" "Aldermere has been charging 8%. Your father's agreement with them specified 4. Callum's expression shifted. It was subtle. She was learning to read the small movements of his face, in the way you learn to read weather on a coast you've moved to. Something tightened around his eyes. "For how long?" "At least 4 years, possibly longer." "I've requested a full accounting." He set his glass down on the side table. "You requested." I wrote to them directly, yes. And to the solicitor. And to the tenant farmers. She kept her voice level. I hope that was not overstepping. Callum looked at her. It was the longest he had looked at her since the wedding. There was something working behind his expression, something she didn't have a name for yet. No, he said finally, it wasn't. He picked up his glass and went back to the study. She stared at the page in front of her, which she was no longer reading, and thought about the word wasn't. It wasn't overstepping. The first complete sentence of approbation she had received from him. She was irritated to find how much it meant to her, and she was determined not to let that irritation go to waste. The meeting with Aldermere happened in December. Isobel took the coach into Dartmouth. Callum came. She had not asked him to, and he hadn't announced his intention to. He had simply appeared beside the carriage in his coat and his hat and gotten in. The office of Aldermere Property and Land was on a narrow street near the harbor. The man they met was not Mr. Staines, who, it turned out, had left the firm 6 weeks after Isobel's first letter, but a senior partner named Mr. Glover, who had the careful, practiced composure of a man who had been in rooms like this many times and had always managed to leave them without losing anything he'd come with. He would not be leaving this one that way. Isobel had brought her notebooks. She had organized the discrepancies by quarter, by year. She had cross-referenced the receipts from the tenant farmers, with the amounts recorded in the ledgers, and the amounts recorded in Aldermere's own correspondence. She laid this out on the desk, in neat order, and she explained what she had found. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She presented the figures and let the figures do what figures do when they are arranged correctly. Mr. Glover grew very still. Callum sat beside her and said nothing. But at one point, when Mr. Glover tried to suggest that the discrepancy might be the result of a billing error, she felt Callum shift in his chair. Not much, just slightly, a settling of weight, and she had learned enough of him by then to recognize it as a signal that he was quietly, no longer willing to be patient. Mr. Glover, Callum said. His voice was quiet and very clear. My wife has shown you 4 years of quarterly records. I suggest we stop discussing the possibility that this is an error. The room was very still after that. They left with a letter of acknowledgement and the promise of full restitution within 60 days. Isobel calculated that the amount owed was close to $1,100. Callum did not speak until they were back in the carriage and moving away from the harbor, and then he said, without looking at her, "You prepared all of that yourself." It wasn't a question. Yes. He was quiet. The carriage moved through the gray December streets. Snow had started, light and sideways. My father was ill for longer than anyone knew, he said. By the time I understood how bad it was, the estate had already been handed over to people who, he stopped. I didn't know what they'd done. I know, she said. I should have come home sooner. She looked at his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the way he was holding himself still. You're here now, she said. It was a simple thing to say, and she wasn't sure she'd meant anything particular by it, but she watched something in his posture shift. A small, real release, the kind you don't perform. January was cold in the particular way of the Nova Scotia coast, which is to say comprehensively and without apology. Isobel organized the repair of the east wing. She hired 2 men from the village to fix the plaster, a third to repair the roof above the back kitchen. She convinced Samuel that the south pasture fencing was his personal enemy and needed to be defeated, and she watched from the kitchen window as he went at it, with a methodical determination she found genuinely admirable. She started the kitchen garden. It was too early to plant anything, but it was not too early to clear, to turn the soil, to begin. She spent 3 mornings out there in the cold with her hands in the dirt, and on the 4th morning, she looked up and Callum was standing at the edge of the garden, watching her. You'll freeze, he said. Probably not. She pulled another dead root free. I run warm. He stood there for a moment. Then he crouched down on the other side of the bed, and began pulling roots with her. They worked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that had changed again. Not stranger silence, not careful silence, but something that was simply 2 people, being in the same place together, occupied by the same task, not needing to fill it. My mother planted this garden, he said. I know, Mrs. Dougal told me. She sat back. She planted it well. The structure is all still there. He looked at the bed. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to say anything else. Then. She died in February, 3 years ago. I was in Montreal when they sent word. I came home for the funeral and then, I don't know why I didn't stay. I've thought about it. I don't have a good answer. Isobel looked at him. His face was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. He looked younger, and also tired, in the way people look when they've been carrying something for long enough that they've stopped noticing the weight of it. Grief does strange things to the geography of a place, she said. Sometimes you can't be in it. He looked at her. Yes, he said. Exactly that. They worked for another hour. When they went inside, he held the door for her. The restitution from Aldermere arrived in February, not the full amount, and 2 weeks later than promised. But Isobel had anticipated both of these things, and had already written to her solicitor to begin the process of terminating the firm's contract and arranging a replacement. She found a new property agent through Bernard, the tenant farmer, who recommended a man named Mr. Osei who worked out of Truro, whom Isobel subsequently met twice and found both honest and meticulous, which were the two qualities she had decided mattered most. The estate was not rich, it would not be rich, but the income from the tenant farms, properly managed, was enough to maintain the house and pay the staff and leave something over, and leaving something over was, in Isobel's experience, all you really needed in order to begin. She told Callum all of this over dinner in late February. It was a Thursday. The dining room had a fire. He listened to the full accounting without interrupting, and when she was done he picked up his wine and looked at it for a moment before setting it down. I should have done this years ago, he said. I should have come home and looked at the books, and you didn't, she said, not unkindly, but someone did. He looked at her. There was something in his expression she recognized now, the look she had first seen in the carriage outside Aldermere's office. A kind of reckoning, a man measuring the distance between where he was and where he should have been, and finding it much longer than he'd told himself. Why did you? He asked. You didn't owe this estate anything. Our arrangement was. I never pretended it was something it wasn't. No, she agreed. You didn't. Then why? She thought about this honestly, the way she thought about most things. Because it was in front of me, she said. Because the numbers were wrong and I knew how to fix them. And because, she paused, because I was here, and if I was going to be here, I wanted to be actually here, not just occupying a room. He was quiet for a long time. I wrote to my mother's sister in December, he said, after Aldermere. She asked me how the estate was and I told her it was being managed well, and she asked who was managing it, and I said, he stopped. I said my wife. Isobel said nothing. I think that was the first time I'd used that word like it meant something, he said. She looked at the fire. It was a difficult thing to hold, not unpleasant, exactly, but real in the way that real things are, with weight and edges. She had not married for love. She had not expected love. She had expected a practical arrangement between two families who needed something from each other, and she had been prepared to live within that arrangement carefully and without complaint. She was not sure, now, that she was prepared for what this was becoming. Callum, she said. Yes, I would like it if you stayed more, here, at the house. She kept her voice even. Not because I require company, but because it seems to me that you've been leaving places before they can mean anything to you, and I think this one is trying. He looked at her steadily. He did not look away. So are you, he said. He stayed, not all at once. Nothing between them had moved all at once, and she trusted the gradual nature of it more than she would have trusted a sudden change. But he stayed through March, and he came with her to meet Mr. Osei in Truro, and he fixed the shutter on the east wall himself one afternoon, with a concentration that told her he needed to do at least one physical concrete thing to feel. The house was his again. She watched him from the garden. She was starting seeds, in the cold frames she'd built with Samuel in February. Her hands were dirty. The light was the particular clear light of a late March day in Nova Scotia. Cold still, but with something in it that wasn't there in December, a promise, or the beginning of one. Mrs. Dougal appeared beside her with 2 cups of tea. He's been up since 6, Mrs. Dougal said, nodding toward Callum on the ladder. Wouldn't let me call Samuel, I know. Isobel accepted the cup. He needs to fix it himself. The older woman looked at her with an expression that was fond and also slightly measuring. You understand him better than he understands himself, she said. He's always been that way. His mother knew him the same way. Isobel looked at the garden. The first pale shoots of what would become the spring planting were just beginning to show at the edge of the cold frame. Barely anything. The suggestion of green. I don't know if that's understanding, she said. I think it's just paying attention. In the evening, Callum came inside and washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and then came to find her in the study where she was reviewing the accounts for the quarter. He stood in the doorway. He was always in doorways, she had noticed, as though he needed to keep the option of leaving, and he looked at her and at the desk covered in paper, and she looked back at him. The shutter is fixed, he said. I saw. The latch was gone entirely. I had to replace the whole mechanism. A pause. He pushed himself off the doorframe and came to the desk and looked at what she was working on. He stood beside her and she could feel him reading. The small movement of his eyes, the slight forward lean. After a moment he pointed to a line on the third page. "That figure is wrong," he said. "That's last quarter's. I saw the new one from Mr. Osei last week." "I know," she said. "I'm waiting for you to give me the letter." He looked at her. Then he went to his coat on the hook in the hall, and came back with the letter and set it on the desk in front of her. She found the correct figure and made the correction. "Thank you," she said. He didn't move. He was standing close enough that she could hear him breathing. "Isobel," he said. She looked up. He had the look he sometimes got when he was about to say something he'd been building toward for a while, like a door he'd been standing outside of and had finally decided to open. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "Marriage. Staying, I haven't. I've not been good at staying in one place. I know, but I want to try, here, with you." He paused. "If you'll let me." She held his gaze. There was nothing performed in his expression, nothing careful or managed. Just the plain fact of a man who had spent 3 years leaving things before they could become real to him, asking if he might be allowed to stop. "You don't need to ask permission," she said. "This is your house." "No," he said. "That's not." He looked at the desk, at the notebooks, at the records organized by quarter and year, at the cold frames in the garden that hadn't existed in September. "This isn't my house the way you're describing it. This is yours. You made it yours." She thought about the first afternoon, the broken shutter swinging in the wind, the collapsed garden, the ledgers with their quiet, fraudulent arithmetic. She thought about the kitchen in the cold dark, eating bread standing up, going back to the desk. She thought about what it means to be left somewhere and what it means to decide, anyway, to stay. "It can be both," she said. He was quiet. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She went back to the accounts. He sat across from her in the lamplight, and he did not leave. Later, when Miss Dougal came to say good night, she paused in the doorway and looked at the two of them. Isobel working, Callum reading, the fire low and the lamp warm between them, and she said nothing at all, only pulled the door softly closed, and went upstairs. Outside, the March wind came in off the Atlantic, but the shutters held.